Okay, so this is abstract particulars without Kenny, because,
Oh.
yeah, I don't know why. But anyway, it's the number 11, for which we read Things Qua Truthmakers by David Lewis. This one is not in either of the anthologies we've been pulling papers from, but it was referenced by the other Lewis reading that we did, which was the fourth of the series. And I'm excited about it. It's actually not as exciting after having read it as I thought it would be, but it it did scratch an itch. It is what I wanted, at
It is.
least
Yeah.
it was in the direction of what I wanted.
Yeah.
So I'm happy we read it, and it may be the last in the series. I guess we have yet to decide when to kill it. This thing does go on, but yeah. So we read Lewis, which basically is his effort to say a little more about truth makers if you're willing to go along with counterpart theory. We also read the Postscript, which he co-authored with Gideon Rosen to address, to go a little further. In the first paper, he addresses predications, addressing the problem raised by RP. How a red rose that might have been white can be a truth maker of the roses being red. And in the Postscript, he addresses negative existentials, the truth that there are no unicorns. And I'm pretty happy with how I did it. What did you guys think? Karen?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think he does an okay job of showing that he can give us an account of truth makers with his possible world framework. But I'm not sure what work the possible world framework is doing, especially with counterpart theory, which just seemed, his version of counterpart theory just seems so odd. I mean, maybe I just not understanding it. It just seems like it's driven now by, like, what counts as a counterpart to any given thing is driven by our intuitions about what's important as a resemblance. And that you can have, it seemed to me that basically you can have counterparts that sort of gallop wildly off in different directions depending on your different properties, the different properties that you have. And so if that's true, if what's basically driving these counterpart relationships is just properties that you have, why mention the word counterpart? I just don't see how the whole metaphysical framework of possible worlds is helping at all here. So, I mean, given a long project where...
I'm sorry, what's wrong with mentioning counterparts exactly?
Well, it's not that there's nothing wrong with it. It's just superfluous, it seems. But I mean, as he says at the end, his view is not that different from Armstrong's view.
Right.
And maybe it is. It's Armstrong's view with talk about possible worlds, because we like to talk about possible worlds if we're Lewis.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I mean, the big thing is I brought back XYZ because now Lewis has reaffirmed to me that XYZ is water, right? There's, in plenty of worlds, water is XYZ. So that's good. I mean, that's nice. I'm not sure if I have to abandon externalism about the mind now as a result. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know. I just have trouble with Lewis's whole philosophical project in terms of finding motivation for it. So, except as a nice fictional way of talking. But anyway,
yeah,
I'm interested to see what Josh has to say.
Yeah, I mean, do you on a scale from 1 to 10, do you hate it as a 7 or a 10?
This is an interesting paper. First of all, so I read the Postscript as well from Rosen, and he's a fictionalist about possible worlds, and he still seems to be in agreement with this. I guess I was really surprised that Lewis makes his account work with Armstrong's account of states of affairs. I was kind of surprised by that. And then after realizing what that meant, I had exactly Karen's thoughts, which was then like, wait, but then why? Except I guess the really sticking point is the the non-mereological composition part seemed like a
Yeah.
really big scab to pick at, and I think that's really important because this keeps coming up in our own discussions. Uh, whether or not these partial relations are mereological, and if they're not, does that allow for identity? And there's a lot of consequences. And Lewis was just straight up and said, I don't know what a composition is apart from mereology, so I don't know what he's talking about. But if he's talking about this, so am I, and we're in agreement. So I do want to follow up on that a little bit more, and it's definitely important to keep in mind, at least as I return to Armstrong, to see if I see that same problem. But having said that, the counterpart stuff is really interesting because the issue that I had with that as well was this sort of this sort of concern or relatedness for picking out these conditions of finding counterparts, and it seemed like whatever determines those conditions could just be whatever determines the truth maker. Like, I'm not sure why, with that in mind, you then construct the counterpart, and then you refer to that thing qua, it being read
Mhm.
as the counterpart conditions, which then gives you the truth maker. Like, wait, no, just stop there. Like, you've done the consideration for the aspect of the thing that makes true. Armstrong's account makes sense because I guess I read two different things about Armstrong that made this all click for me. This was one of them. I should say the third thing, that he has the dependence relation switched. So the dependence is between states of affairs and the subject. So he sort of hoists up the dependence rather than pushing it down. So the states of affairs are always going to be the truth maker for some aspect about the entity. That's a really interesting twist. And that's where I need to read more about what he's doing with mereology. So he's denying that it's this mereological sum, but he's hoisting up the dependence to the states of affairs, and it's a non-mereological sum. So I don't know, there's some tension here, and it's really interesting. I see what Lewis is saying, and I agree with him there, but then the counterpart stuff seems superfluous. Once you fix the conditions of concern, that lets you then determine the counterpart, qua, like some entity, qua that thing you're concerned with. You've already done the work, it seems. So I was just really surprised that possible worlds weren't doing more work. They seemed to be kind of just there after the fact.
Hmm.
He just needed the word counterpart, and that comes
Right.
from the
Yeah.
possible world framework, right? So,
No.
okay.
The only thing I could think of that work it was doing is that so we seemed to think with Rodriguez Pereira that he was very generous with the entities, right? And some theorists were like, well, you can't, because the redness of the rose is one entity and the lightness of the rose is another entity. Reason, there's two propositions: the rose is red and the rose is light, and they're grounded by some entity and they're in a relationship, but we assumed they'd be different ones, right? And that seems like there's an awful lot of entities now, millions of them associated with every rose. And what Lewis seems to do is not challenge the idea that we're basically going to have a relationship between entities here that's making this whole system work, but we'll quarantine excessive entities in possible worlds.
Right.
Because that's really easy to do, right? Because there's a mind-boggling infinite number of those already, right? So what makes the entity that makes the rose is red and the rose is light true is just this one thing, the rose, on Lewis's view. But the difference in the truth making of those two propositions, that the connection between the rose is red and this one rose light rose, it's that relationship rose has counterpart relations with possible worlds where I guess it's a different color, but it's still light, right? And that's the counterpart relations that are relevant somehow for making the roses light true. And I guess there's counterpart relations where the rose is, everything else about the rose changes at this redness or something like that. I mean, I guess I think I still don't know the details. It's be worth going through how it all works. But the idea is that there's still relations, and those relations are relations between entities, right? The rose and its counterparts in all these other worlds. And that's what's going to account somehow for this grounding to work. But
well, I think part of the important aspect of the counterpart theory was it somehow introducing this essentiality to that subject qua aspect as truth maker that the counterpart
Right.
theory lets you say of the object that was otherwise contingent. Like it may, the cat may contingently be black, but if you say the cat qua black, you introduce this essentiality, which then allows it to serve as a truth maker. I suppose that's sort of crucial for all these accounts we've read. So maybe he only gets that essential aspect or essential relationship with the possible worlds, with the counterpart connection. That seems to be an important reason why, because otherwise he's not sure how Armstrong is getting that from
Right. But
from
it's
his
a weird essentiality, right? It's an
kid.
essentiality
It's like this
that's
arbitrary
sort of,
concern that fixes essentiality that allows it to be a truth maker.
Well, it's
yeah.
it's not so arbitrary. I mean, it's motivated. It's motivated by what one wants to say. I mean, that's the argument he has to make anyway.
But why do you want to say that? I mean, aren't you already at a point where you somehow determine the aspect of the thing that makes the thing that you want to say true? Like, why do you need to fix your concern and then that fixes your counterpart conditions, which then
Because
fixes
because it's because of the predication. So the cat alone, when you say the cat is black, sorry, what is the example? Long is the name of his cat. So when you say long is black, long alone doesn't involve the predicate, and so you involve the predicate by by reconstruing the relevant counterparts together with the actual long to make up long qua black. And that's it's just the identification of the relevant truth maker or the correct truth maker uh, with contributions from both long and the predicate black. So it's not arbitrary at all. It's motivated by the fact of predication. Now you're right that there are determinations to pick out the relevant worlds and counterparts that seem to make possible world talk superfluous if you could just appeal to the determinations themselves. But there are two reasons why he does it the way he does. First, because alternatively, you have to go the way of states of affairs. And Lewis would argue that that's just another way of talking about possible worlds. So you're not really getting away with it. You're just changing the verbiage, plus introducing some problems for which he presents answers elsewhere. And the other reason you want to bring in possible worlds is so that you can say that a role is played by false makers as well as truth makers, and that the truth makers don't have to be at the actual world, which solves a variety of problems, especially negative existentials. And well, he doesn't bring up modal truths, but I think it would come up there too.
But that's not his motivation in the paper we read. It's used by Rosen in the Postscript to show that it also works for negative existentials, but he doesn't need it for that. He wants to vindicate the truth making principle, right?
No, you're absolutely right. He doesn't. I don't think it's because. Okay, so I'm extending. The paper only deals with predication. He's just being careful. And you're right. The Postscript tackles one more thing, but there are many more problems that he doesn't tackle. Yeah. But I think it's motivated enough to bring in predication, because after all, predication would otherwise involve universals, and that's, as we observed in previous reading, going to bring up modal truth anyway.
Okay, but here's the one thing that's really weird. I was really surprised that he brought in Parsons' work on the part-whole relationship that we read, and it seems to be doing a lot of work here. And I wasn't sure what that framework would need from possible worlds. So he's sort of doing the same hoisting that Armstrong is doing with this part-whole composition. I'm not sure what beyond that we need to determine a counterpart. All you need is something that encompasses the parts that you're concerned with, like the blackness of long, and you're done. Like, I don't know why you need to go on to possible world talk. That seems like it's it. That was all Parsons needed, and Lewis is using the same part-whole hoisting, and then counterparts. I don't get why what work that's doing, as Karen said. I just don't get it. Like, you have everything you
Yeah, and
need.
I don't see how the predication, just positing the possible worlds, because the cats are black in the other worlds, right? So there's predication going on in the other worlds.
Right.
I mean, you can pretend it's just, you're just pointing out to a set of cats, but then he has things about, well, you have to answer the question, why this set? Because you could say that, why not throw in a dishwasher? into the mix, and call it long as well. And the reason why the dishwasher doesn't make the cut is that there's just, that's not a
Well,
counterpart for long. We all know that, right? It's that there's no important similarities here or relevant similarities or something. So what precisely makes it similar seems to be something about what you predicate of that cat or of things along the history of producing that cat, or like holding things similar, holding things the same. What does it mean to hold things the same without a notion of predication? What's sameness without already having a theory of predication, right? Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure I understand your objection, Josh, when you say that you don't understand what the counterparts to long are doing. Are you suggesting that long at the actual world is a sufficient truth maker for long is black?
That's Lewis's view.
That seems to be exactly what Lewis is saying, but getting to that conclusion by way of counterparts.
Well, the
And
reason, okay, so try this out. So I think the reason why that's not enough is because well, before you introduce counterpart theory, it's because you want to address the problem raised by RP, which is that since long might not have been black, then you can no longer say that that truth supervenes on being necessarily. You want to say that there's a necessary connection to the truth maker.
yes,
Once you bring in necessity, you bring in counterparts. The point of counterpart theory here is nothing other than to give an analysis to the necessity of the truth maker principle.
yeah, that's what I thought. That's how I read it. But then I was left. Once you pick out long qua black, haven't you done that? Why do you need to fix a counterpart across possible worlds in order to establish that necessity? Haven't you
Because
already
if
done
you
it by
don't
saying
do
long
that,
qua black?
because if you just say long is black and then pick up the counterparts of long, then long won't be black at all. That is, the counterparts of long won't all be black.
Yeah, but you've already introduced
Right.
counterparts. I mean, what I don't get
Yeah, because
is being
I don't
black is
understand your
not
question. Are you asking why counterparts are introduced? We already established that you can't, with his analysis of modality, speak to the necessity of the truth maker principle without counterparts.
right.
I don't think we have made that clear, right? So the basic idea is that if you want to try and understand truth making as a type of necessitation, right, which I'm not sure I'm happy with, it didn't work as entailment. I'm not sure necessitation is going to be that much more useful. But anyway, then you want to say if A is a truth maker for proposition P, then whenever A is in a world, if you want to use world talk, P must be true. Necessarily P is true.
Right.
So the problem is with long being possibly a purple cat. If long, just as A is the truth maker, then you put that cat in a world and it doesn't necessarily make P true, because if it's purple long, then P is false. So I guess what he's saying with counterparts is, well, we have to make sure only certain versions of long get in that equation, right?
Into the
Become
truth
the
maker
A,
relation.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So our P just says what you put in there is basically a way of being, right? Which is long's being black.
Right.
And that's a perfectly good thing to put into an equation of that sort. It's a wonderful A, right? We can talk about them. Everybody understands them intuitively, right? Ways of being. So you pop in long. It's anytime you put in long being black, you'll get that way of being in a world. You'll get long is black. It's true, right? So yeah, so that's his answer. But Lewis would say, well, look here, I've got a way where all you put in is a cat, right? But you've got this big possible world drawer full of cats. But I'm just going to say that, because of the proposition that you've got, the big drawer of longs to choose from becomes a smaller drawer of longs to choose from. And every time you pick one of those out, the longs qua blacks, you're going to make that proposition true.
Right.
Because it's a small set and it's well curated, right? And I think it's just well curated by your understanding of what it means to be for long to be black, right? By the predication that you already do.
Exactly.
What's
Yes.
wrong with that? No, that's
Yeah.
good. That's an analysis of what predication
So
is.
so predication drives the analysis. It doesn't explain it.
It's
Right.
not meant to explain it. The predication is what is being explained. It's the other way around.
No, that's what I'm saying. Predication explains possible worlds and how they work. Possible worlds do not explain predication.
Well, okay. What explains what is an interesting question. I'm not sure how you would answer that question, given your plural animadversions to to the grounding relation. But since I think that the grounding relation does tell us what the order of explanation is, and I think, well, I don't know if he says, actually, no, he does say, he says truth supervenes on being, right? So insofar as truth includes, well, what we can say about truth includes what we might want to say about predication, then predication would supervene on being. And he's quite clear that by being, he doesn't mean actual being, but being actual or possible. So
right. Well, whatever
grounding predication on counterpart theory, or rather on counterparts.
And I would say predication, you're right. Predication supervenes on actual being. And whatever it supervenes on is what's driving intuitions about possible worlds.
I mean, that might be, okay, so if you are less confident about a possible world's metaphysics than you are about predication, you may be inclined to think that the former can be explained by the latter. And that may well be, in the same way that you can explain molecules by talk of electron microscopes and theories.
No. It would definitely be more akin to believing you could explain molecules through atoms, right? Because possible worlds seem much more plentiful than the actual. It's more of a you're building up from the actual to the possible. So I think it would be as crazy thinking of predication and the actual as being what explains the possible, is more akin to thinking that atoms could explain a molecule than what you're saying.
If by explanation you have in mind something like construction, of course, but possible worlds are not constructions on this account.
I think they are. They're metaphysical constructs.
Well, there might be on someone's account of possible worlds, but not on Lewis's.
Oh, I'm not so
that might be Rosen's
sure.
account.
Right. Yeah. And I'm just thinking that if he's right, then the constructions of these worlds, these fictions, are based, I think, on predication, right? That is, grounded in our world, or the equivalents of which are in our world, or we can refer to. I mean, if we're talking about predication as a thing that happens in a proposition, right? The attribution of a property, for example, to something, then I think that happens at every world. And sure how we could expect these explain it.
I lost you there.
Right. So if the thing that makes the relevant counterpart relations is that you go out and you look for all the black longs, right? It's a horrible, unfortunate name, right?
Well, it's his cat. I mean,
I know.
I thought it was Tibbles, though. Maybe Tibbles had died by then.
Yeah. There's long, black, thick particulars.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't
That's
know.
bad, Josh.
I don't
Very
know.
bad.
Hey,
I mean,
Lewis
maybe
wrote
we
it
should.
multiple times.
Yeah. Phew.
Okay, look, you know what? Forget about like, it really kills me that you're worrying about the construction of possible worlds the very next week after shitting on grounding relations. I mean, it's like, if you're not going to accept the grounding relation, okay, you're not entitled to use in
I
virtue
never
of or
rejected,
constructions or
I
any of that.
never rejected the grounding
No, you didn't.
relationship.
Josh did. You're right. Not
I
Wilson,
did.
Yeah,
just
I
Josh.
Let's
said,
be
I
clear who took the shit.
understand.
It was me.
I understand where Wilson's worries come from, because it does seem like people just use this as a sort of all-encompassing magic
Yes.
relationships, whereas there seems to be pretty interesting differences in different types of grounding, right?
Mhm.
So like you know, the the upward ones and the downward ones, and the as the, you know, the grounding relationships where you feel a strong temptation to ask whether or not they're actually the same thing, right? So if a molecule is grounded in the atoms, if facts about molecules are grounded in facts about atoms, does that just mean that molecules are atoms arranged in such a way, or they're facts about the very same thing, very same subject matter?
Okay.
But it seems like with propositions and the truth with propositions and truth makers, we're not that tempted, unless we're identity theory, as we're early Russell, to think they're the same thing. So is there another category of synchronic relationships where you're not really tempted to think they're the same thing?
I guess what
uh,
my
and
thinking is
and in that case, does it mean it's not really even close to a part-whole relationship? It's something else, but maybe
I'm
there's
actually
another
thinking it
analogy
with
or model we
counterpart
can get our
theory.
minds around.
I'm thinking that
So
with counterpart theory, you can recover a Russellian approach to propositions. Now, it's not going to be Lewis exactly, because Lewis is very much committed to propositions as sets of possible worlds, which is more the Wittgensteinian conception of propositions. But if you take a Russellian conception, by the way, that's just a traditional way of saying propositions are either, well, the worlds, or some kind of like structure that represents, well, let's just leave it at that, some kind of structure that resembles the syntax of a sentence. So I prefer the latter view. And if that can be hybridized with a concretism of possible worlds, then what? Sorry, I got lost. Oh yes, then
so is
then the grounding relation of possibilia to propositions is mereological after all. And that's what I was hoping to see some sign of here. But then I realized, no. He likes propositions as sets of possible worlds. It's just not going to come up.
So is that why he's, I mean, so what is that why he's worried about negative existentials? Because if a proposition is a set of possible worlds, you might want to think that the proposition is likely to be the set of possible worlds he's identified as its truth maker. But
Right.
surely, if the truth maker for there are no unicorns is something like our entire world and worlds that contain our entire world and nothing else, I guess, except maybe added dimensions,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
all negative existentials will be the same proposition.
Yes.
So
I think
that can't be the case, because they seem to be different propositions. Like there are no unicorns and there are no griffins seem to say different things.
Right. See, he at the beginning of the first paper, he entertains the possibility that, or maybe I misread this. But this is what I vaguely remember, that maybe true propositions don't all have truth makers. Instead, they just fail to have false makers. Maybe he says if the truth maker principle is incorrect, then many more cases may be possible. A proposition may be positive or negative or both or neither, etc. So maybe a true proposition is negative if it is true in virtue of not having a false maker. I thought that might be a way of handling unicorns just fine without having to speak of.
But still you need the set of possible worlds that are the proposition itself. And why can't that just be the truth maker for that proposition? If the real world is one of those.
Because it would have to be at the world at which it is true.
What do you mean at the world in which it is
So
true?
so the actual world has no unicorns, right? But this other world does have unicorns, right? We want to say that the proposition there are no unicorns is true, but not in general. It is true at this world. It is not true at that world. If and so what makes it true at this world can't be the unicorn, because the unicorn is at that world. However, the unicorn at that world could be a false maker that has no counterpart at this world. And that becomes a negative proposition with a.
But there are no unicorns as itself a set of possible worlds, right?
Yes, and at none of those worlds is there a false maker.
Right. So basically that's just the truth maker, but that's going to be our world and lots of other worlds.
It's not a truth maker because it doesn't exist at the world at which the proposition is true.
Yeah, it does.
How so?
Because
it has to exist at the world at which it is true. I mean, you're right that it makes it true. Okay.
So propositions don't exist.
No, I'm not talking about the proposition.
World.
I'm talking about the truth maker.
Well, I'm trying to talk about the proposition qua set of possible worlds, and they don't exist at our world. So no propositions exist at our world.
Yeah, that's fine. But the
so why are we worried about whether or not their truth makers exist at our world?
Because the question is not at what world the proposition exists. The question is, at what world is the proposition true? And at what world does the truth maker or false maker exist? Remember, the necessity relationship here is not about existence on both sides or truth on both sides.
Yeah, and I know. And what I'm asking is, you consider the set of possible worlds that are identical with the proposition, there are no unicorns. Now go to any one of those worlds in that set. Is it not true that there are no unicorns?
Sorry, I got distracted. Can you say that again?
So consider the set of possible
unicorn
worlds. maybe it's let's maybe get away from that. Consider the set of possible worlds that is Ralph the dog is brown, right? So the possible worlds that is Ralph is brown, right? That's a proposition. It's a set of possible worlds. Go to any one of them. Is it not true that Ralph is brown?
Yes.
Right. So
yes.
At that world, yeah, right. So why not just say that the truth maker for a proposition is the set of worlds that make it the proposition that it is?
Well, you have to distinguish truth conditions from truth makers, right? Possible worlds just fix the truth conditions, but the proposition will be true at a world or false at a world, right? So you have to.
But I'm saying if you think that there's nothing.
If the truth makers were the worlds at which the proposition is true, then it wouldn't be. You wouldn't have truth makers for contingent propositions.
No, you would. I mean, you would, because so let's say, I mean, what's wrong with what I just said about, if you think of Ralph is brown as a set of possible worlds, what possible world set could it be other than the sets where all the sets where it's also true that Ralph is brown?
Yes, it is exactly that set.
Right.
No more, no less.
But the actual world has to be in that set. I mean, that's the difference.
For it to be true in this world, yeah.
In this world,
but we could just define truth maker as the
set of the worlds
proposition is the set A truth maker is any given world in that set.
But sets aren't worlds. Sets have worlds as members.
Right. So that's why you have a new word called truth maker. Right. The proposition is the set. The truth maker is any given world within that set. Any of them can be a truth maker. Just like
you're not wrong.
Any dog can be a truth maker for there is a dog.
Of course, you're not wrong. And in fact, many of the papers we've read have said as much, that for any truth with the truth maker, the whole world is also such a truth maker. But the question is, how can we identify, well, it's one of the questions we're asking is whether there are minimal truth makers. Another question is, what is the necessary relationship between the truth and the truth makers? It's trivially true, and it has been observed by many, that the entire world can function as a truth maker. But I think something is lost in the analysis if we go there. For instance, it tells us nothing about entailment relationships, which are given by mereological relationships between the distinct truth makers of distinct propositions. If all the true propositions just have the entire actual world as their truth maker, we would have nothing to say about how any truth entails any other.
But I'm not sure that we get that with the counterpart relationships.
Well, I mean, we could explore that, but we know we're not going to get it with your proposal.
Well, are we or are we not? I mean, if you could say something like Ralph is brown entails that there is a dog that's brown, and that means that if you look at the set of truth makers for Ralph is brown, you'll find that they're contained within, or all the worlds that serve as a truth maker for Ralph is brown also serve as a part of the truth maker for, there is a dog or something like that, right? You could just have relationships between sets of possible worlds.
Yeah,
that explain your entailment.
I
mean, I think that's the whole point of saying a proposition is a set of worlds, because the idea that a proposition is a set of worlds is weird anyway, right? Because you're bringing a lot into this talk about Ralph the brown dog, like stars, galaxies, planets. Like you'd like, I mean, some of them think that really, that proposition is not about a world, but about a dog. Like it's just about a dog. It's not about space-time and all the other things that are in a universe. It's about a dog. And so we're saying no, it's a proposition is a set of possible worlds. I don't know why you would have any problem with saying, yeah, well, okay, so then truth makers are the sets, are the worlds that make up those sets.
Well, they can't be, right? Because unicorns exist as a proposition, picks out the worlds in which unicorns exist or whatever the parts are needed. And if that set made the proposition true, then the proposition that unicorns exist would be true in our world where there are no unicorns. So it can't be the same, right? I mean, Lewis has to say
no, it would be you could find where it's true. You just go to one of those worlds, but our world isn't in that list, so it's not true for us.
No, it is true for us precisely because we're not on the list.
Right.
The proposition is not that there are unicorns, but that there aren't.
Oh, if the proposition is that there are no unicorns, then that's a set of worlds. And in every one of those worlds you go and you won't find a unicorn. And we're in that set, so it's true. It's that one's true for us.
Right, but that has nothing to do with like that.
But if you go to worlds where
I understand what you're saying.
You'll find it's true that there are unicorns.
I understand what you're saying, but the problem is that you're just using propositions themselves as their own truth makers, which obviates the entire point of truth maker theory.
No,
because find a correspondence between propositions and reality. If propositions are sets of worlds,
and truth makers are the
propositions
things in
are
the
constituted
sets.
by reality. But that's a cheap a way to employ a particular theory of propositions to escape saying anything more about what it is that relates propositions to the world. In other words, if you're committed to the Lewisian picture of propositions as sets of worlds, it would seem that nothing is gained with anything, with any additional theorizing about exactly how propositions supervene on being. It would seem that way. I don't think that's true, but I can see where you're going. But we don't have to be committed to the conception of propositions, first of all. And second, by narrowing down exactly what it is about those worlds that is the subject matter of the proposition, we find our way to an explanation that relates reality to the constituents of the proposition as articulated, not as sets of possible worlds, but as an expression in reference to dogs. You know, so a world that includes all the stars and everything else says nothing about dogs. But if we relate it to what is common to all those worlds, namely the dog, especially the dog qua black, if the proposition is the dog is black, then we have something explanatory with respect to truth, which is what we wanted.
Right, but I think both Joshua and I are thinking, yeah, that's exactly what you do. You narrow it down and you give up all this talk about possible worlds. You just get to the dog and its blackness or its brownness.
Yeah, no, that's fine if you're not interested in the necessity of the truth maker relation. But of course, if you're not interested in that, you're not interested in truth maker.
No. Because if you get down to the dog and its brownness, and then you say, anytime you put the dog and its brownness in a world, you got the dog as brown as true.
Once you're talking about worlds, you're already talking about possible worlds. I don't know why you just.
No, you can just use the actual one. You put it in the actual world.
Only talk about the actual world. You're not talking about modality anymore.
Yeah, let's just talk about the dog you put in the world.
That's fine, but then you can't talk about what makes the truth maker principle necessary. Perhaps you don't think it is necessary.
I'm not sure that necessitation helps.
Okay.
I don't. Yeah.
Okay. That explains your reticence to.
Well, no. I mean, so far we've read nobody has been able to make it work. Armstrong just says necessitation plus, and everybody says something star plus. Nobody has made it work.
No,
right?
I'm not. That's a different issue. Like,
right. I mean, even Lewis here is saying
is one issue. Whether we can make the analysis consistent and sufficient, that's a secondary issue. But I'm just speaking to the motivation. Like, why would you even want the truth maker principle to be necessary?
I mean, I think it is necessary, but I don't think that helps us. That sort of magically explains the relationship.
It's what is to be explained. It isn't. It isn't the explanation.
So I thought what we learned from Parsons was that you need an internal relation that is essential, and that it is the essential nature of that property that allows the truth-making relation to be necessary. But I'm not sure how. I sort of agree with Lewis that you need an account of modality to make that leap. But I thought that's what Armstrong was doing as well, in a piecemeal fashion. So I'm not sure, even if you need that essentiality to bridge to necessity to make this truth making a necessary one, I'm not sure why you need possible worlds and counterparts to do that. It seems like that's a step too far.
Well, okay, so those are two different issues, right? So Karen is not so sure about that any work is being done by the necessity of the truth maker principle without going so far as to deny that it is necessary. And you, Josh, are not so sure why this necessity isn't well enough addressed by Armstrong's approach of states of affairs, such that we would need to bring in counterparts. So that's let me address a second issue, because I think in already making that concession, I think I have more to say about it. What it comes down to is just having prior theories of modality. So this is not a place to argue about which is the right analysis of modality. Armstrong has his.
Here's
Lewis
what.
has his.
Where,
hold on a second. But Lewis, wanting to be neutral about this, goes so far as to point out that their respective theories about truth makers don't look that different. And we can go down the list of the similarities that he draws out and maybe attend specifically to where they are different. That might motivate going one way or the other. But the real motivation is going to be elsewhere, where they argue for and against distinct conceptions of modality. And neither is going to, in doing so, argue for the need to bring modality into a truth maker theory at all. Which is
let's say, yeah, I don't know that. I think, let's put it this way, necessitation might be a bonus of the special relationships between propositions and their truth makers, but I don't think it's definitive of that relationship. So imagine if the only thing in the universe was just one particle with one property, let's say a negative charge or whatever. I don't know what a single particle can have. Spin. Yeah, lonely. One particle and it's lonely. Yeah, I like it. Now, I think in this universe it's true that the electron is lonely, right? Now, it could be that one of the things that follows from that is that if you took that poor electron and threw it into another universe, but let's say there's no possibility of anything other than this, otherwise this is really lonely. Like there's just no modality in this universe. There's no possible other universes we could put this unicorn, this lonely particle in. But if we did, you'd be putting a lonely particle into that universe. That probably might cheer up if there's another particle in there. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen with that particular particle, right? But yeah, but it's still true, independent of any of that throwing it in other universes talk or whatever, that it's true that there was a lonely particle in this universe. That's all there was. It's also true that that's all there was in this universe. And the necessitation of taking it to other places and seeing if things are still true might be a consequence, but it's not.
Well, no, because the lonely particle would be in a world, and so the loneliness would be an extrinsic property in relation to the world as a whole, and so it's still going to be the
it'd be an intrinsic property. Give the
true.
particle an intrinsic property, right?
But the world,
whatever you
the
think.
intrinsic property of the lonely particle would make true that the particle is lonely, right? So that's still.
Yeah, it makes it. Oh, you think it? Yeah, it makes it true. Yeah, it makes it true. But is that a relationship of? Is that a relationship of necessitation? Well, if in order to test that it's a relationship of necessitation means throw it into other worlds and see what happens, then that's true. Then no, let's just say you can't. There's no modality here. But there's still the making true, I think, without necessitation. So I think necessitation, if necessitation is understood by like talk about possibilities and throwing things into other worlds, then I think that the truth making relationship predates all that business.
That's interesting.
Because
okay.
we still have to look into these worlds and see if it's lonely, for crying out loud.
Well,
we're asking a question. Is it lonely? Yes, it's lonely. So we already have the way of asking and answering that question before we start throwing it into other worlds and checking if it's necessarily lonely.
So this is the exact thought process like a month or two ago that for a moment made me a modal realist. Because I thought, well, then you need modal realism to make that truth. But you're just denying necessitation. That's interesting.
I don't think you can deny the necessity of the truth maker relationship.
No, let's just say there's making, right? So like I come home and I make pasta for dinner. And someone said, "Did you have to make pasta for dinner?" And I'm like, "I don't think so. I had other things in the fridge." Or, "Yeah, I did because there was nothing else in the fridge." The making might be completely independent from necessitation. So it could be that the lonely particle makes the proposition this particle is lonely true, independent of all of this necessitation. If necessitation is this special philosophical thing that involves taking this poor particle and throwing them into other possible universes, which there may not be any possible universes, because maybe this is a universe without modality. There's nothing in the laws that allows anything else to happen except this poor lonely particle. Make a salad, yeah.
Makes no sense.
Make room for another drink. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, I mean, look, I mean, I'm very accustomed to the blank stare. I get that you don't like all these worlds. But the fact remains that without a necessity to the relation between the truth maker and the true proposition, then the making relation is not explanatory. And you can give that up, but then you're giving up a correspondence theory of truth as well, in my opinion.
Don't you need a theory modality even to say that the truth making is not necessary? Because if you're going to say that it's possible that the proposition was false, even though there's a lone particle, then you still have an account of possibility, and
No,
that's still
no,
going to be reality, right?
to say that the proposition might have been false is just to say that the truth maker might not have that there might not have been that truth maker.
Well, no, I mean that just presupposes necessity, right? That truth making is necessary.
I'm not.
If it's possible that the
I,
proposition was
I
false,
think
it's
I
possible that
think
the
the
entity didn't exist.
I think
What I'm saying
even
is that
asking
the necessity is corresponds to the biconditional, not to the proposition in the antecedent.
I think asking the question, is it possible for that to be false, implies that you already have this look, when you sort of learning logic, right, you have this, you start with true and false and assigning that to things like f of a, and then only later do you get all this talk of possibility and necessity. And it seemed like you did pretty good up to then, still assigning true and false to things.
That's when the
Before
attrition
someone
kicks
even
in.
introduced this notion of could this thing that's true possibly have been false, right? I mean, and so you can say, well, even up to that point, I was assigning false to some things and true to some things. So yeah, there's a different relationship between a proposition and a truth maker and a proposition and other things. There's a different relationship. But if we're going to think about necessitation in terms of, and possibility in terms of, alternative scenarios, then we have to have a first way of understanding what those alternative scenarios are. And it's hard to do that without already having a pretty strong notion about the truth-making relationship that's going to connect the things you say to these quote unquote possibilities.
Yeah, look, I have nothing
and flesh them out for you.
hanging on what things are easier to understand. It's not unusual
Right.
for the ground to be harder to understand than what is being grounded. That's actually typical. This might just be another case of that.
Could be.
Is there anything in the text we wanted to review?
That's great. Why would we do that?
Right.
I didn't highlight
okay,
anything.
here's one
The
last thing, right?
Okay.
Let's say you're trying to understand what it means to say that it is necessary that P, and it seems a very natural way to understand that is to say something like, well, P is always true, right? So it could be that this notion of truth and the truth-making relationship is precisely what grounds our understanding of things like necessity and possibility. And so the relationship between truth and the true makers is primitive or somehow what necessity is based on rather than the vice versa. And that's my suspicion.
Yeah, you lost me.
Well, so what does it mean to say that 2 + 2 is 4 is necessarily, is it 2 + 2 is necessarily 4? It might be that in every world 2 + 2 is 4 is true, right?
Mathematical truths are going to be hard to deal with in this model, and many of these authors say as much. So do you mind using a contingent truth or even necessary truth about contingent entities?
So yes, in every what does it mean to say that in every non-empty world there's something, right? Or something. It just means it's true that there's something in every non-empty world, right? So it's the truth, universal truth across all possible worlds is what explains necessity.
Yeah.
So it's truth that is explaining necessity, not vice versa. So why should we think that necessity is going to sneak around the back and explain something important about truth?
Because explanation.
I think truth maybe is primitive.
Right.
Necessity is backing on.
I'll answer the question. So because explanation is sometimes following an argument, and sometimes it's following grounding relations, sometimes causal relations. And while I admit that you can have an explanation as you just offered, it doesn't follow that that tells us anything about what's making what. And
Right.
the
As
truth-maker
long,
relation
yeah,
is not defined in terms of explanation. It's the other way around. Explanation is grounded in the truth-making relation, or at least some
so then,
explanations are.
right. So the challenge is to give it a count of necessitation that doesn't use the word truth.
Um, and
Because
well,
presumably
so,
when you're
okay,
using
okay,
true,
yes, okay, we can do
there's
that.
some
Sure,
appeal to truth making.
of course, we can do that. It's just well, it depends on your, I mean, what you're asking for is a metaphysics of possible worlds. Okay, so there's Armstrong's and Lewis's. And I don't really know what Armstrong's is exactly, but in Lewis's, it is just about um, 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 entities existing at entities and their counterparts existing at worlds. Okay, that doesn't mention truth directly or indirectly, I should say. And that is how you do the possible world semantics in terms of a model theory of worlds construed as wholes with parts. I think that answers the question.
No, it doesn't give me necessity. It gives me some claim about worlds.
Right, of course, but you define necessity in terms of everything I just said. So to be
Yeah, go
necessary,
ahead.
so for f of a to be true is for a, which names an element, and f, which names an extension, to be such that a is a member of the extension. And for f of a to be necessarily true, or rather for f to be a to be necessarily f, without reference to truth, is just for it to be the case that at every world accessible to A, for every world, that at every world A is in the extension of F at that world. And that's all without reference.
Isn't that typically how true is defined, is by, for a claim f of a is true if A is in the extension of F. So that's not getting rid of truth. That's the definition of truth.
I didn't mention truth, but of course, if you want to define truth, you'll do it in terms of the definition of predication if it's the truth of a predication. But that doesn't mean that
Right.
predication is defined in terms of truth. It just means
So,
that
but it does mean
you can
that,
bring in truth. Of course, you can do that.
but basically, so if you're saying that f of a is necessary if f is part of the extension of A
At every world.
in every world, right? Yeah. And I'm saying, yeah, this is how you're taught necessitation. You're taught, okay, we assign truth values to things, and we assign truth values to f of A if A is in the extent, if A is in the extension of F, and then if in every world or always A is in the extension of F, it can't be, then we say necessarily f of A. But we still go through this theory of truth, right?
I don't think so. That's not how I learned modal
It's
logic.
just that F is
The
in the
modal logic I
extension of
learned
A.
does not quantify over propositions and truth values. Of course, there are theorems, and the theorems are true, but that doesn't mean that you are actually talking about propositions using your logic. Whereas the truth-maker principle does do that.
Oh, so you're not talking about propositions because you're talking about properties and their extensions?
Well, you're not even talking about properties. You're using predicates to talk about objects, such as the object A.
So you're just talking about extensions.
Not even. You're just, you're talking about objects and predicating over them.
Which means?
Just that. If, for instance, the predicate is.
But you're just
brown,
talking about objects, right?
If, for instance, if the predicate is brown and the object is your dog, you're not talking about the extension of brown things. You're just talking about the dog, and you're saying of the dog that it is brown. Now, of course, there are those who
But
will
it's part of the
say
extension
that.
of brown things.
Of course, there are those who will say more in the model, but that doesn't mean that that's what you're saying in the proposition that is being modeled. Okay, it's just a way of modeling the semantics. So my point is just that whereas in every logic or ordinary logic, the theorems will be true, the negations of the theorems will be false, and that there will be truth tables in which we talk about true and false, and the whole logic textbook will be strewn with the words true and false. That's, yes, of course, but that's because you have the logic, and then you have a textbook which is talking about the logic. But the logic itself is not talking about truth, not typically. Whereas in a theory of truth, a theory of truth makers, the logic itself, that is the truth maker principle, is talking about the attribution of truth. And that's more than what logic gives you. Therefore, if you are giving an account of truth making in terms of modal logic, it's not circular, because modal logic is not already talking about truth, even though the theorems of your logic are true. They're also in English, but the modal logic is not about English either.
I find that very counterintuitive, that logic is not talking about truth. I think that if it's not talking about truth, then the logical notion of necessitation is not something we should demand of the relationship between truth and the truth makers, if it's not talking about truth.
Well, okay, I'm not sure why you think so. But I'm not saying modal logic can't be used to talk about truth. You can use it to talk about anything. The point is that the logic on its own is not yet talking about anything in particular. It's just a way of saying that something is necessarily so-and-so. Or such and such, I should say.
Yeah.
Anyway, do you have any interest in going over the 5 points where he compares his ideas to Armstrong's? I was excited to see. I mean, I still don't know what our states of affairs are. So points 1 and 2 gave me a better picture than I had so far of what states of affairs are for Armstrong. But in the end, I was thrown by, I forget which one, but it was either 3 or 4, where they come apart a little bit. Oh yes, when it's Armstrong is speaking of a non-mereological composition, and Lewis says, well, I don't know what that means, because like, I think they're always, mereology is a theory of composition, so how could you really do that? But I like his move. It's very cute, where he says, what cannot be understood literally can perhaps be understood analogically. And he suggests, if necessary connections between distinct existences are forbidden, then mereological composition, in which the whole is not distinct from its parts, but rather is partially identical to each of them, becomes a license for necessary connections. Maybe it means to say that a state of affairs that is unmereologically composed of its constituents bears a necessary connection to them, the necessary connection considered in the previous paragraph. If that is what the claim of unmereological composition means, we already have seen that. It applies just as well to long qua black. So in each of these points, right, he's just saying that he's doing pretty much the same thing, except in the treatment of the predicate exactly. But I didn't know what turned on that, because I don't understand Armstrong's theory well enough yet. It seems to be on point 4 now. Now I remember. He says, I deny that long qua black is mereologically composed of long and blackness. Long, yes, he is part of the long qua black because he is the whole of long qua black, but blackness, no. All I know about Armstrong is that states of affairs are supposed to be whatever it is that we're talking about when we nominalize a sentence. When we say Long's being black, that's the state of affairs. But that has never really meant very much to me. Long's being black strikes me as a mere grammatical shift that is necessitated by the way we speak, but it's equivalent to just quoting it. You're either talking about the proposition or the sentence or something. I don't know. Like, I just don't know what to do with that. Which isn't to say it's wrong. It just means he has to give us metaphysics. And of course he did. I just haven't read the book.
But I mean, this is core to the issue of what makes a truth maker a truth maker.
Absolutely.
And I guess I don't know the details of what Armstrong has in mind, but I'm not sure that. I guess I'm not sure. So what Lewis says, long qua black is not something distinct from long. Long is a part of long qua black, but blackness is not. So
Well,
long
the
qua
other way
black.
around. Long qua black is a part of long.
No, actually, they're identical.
No, they're
So,
identical.
Long qua black, but long qua black. Well, no, because long might have been.
No, it says he is
No,
part
but he
of
isn't.
long qua black. He says he is part of, but also identical with, and there's no blackness.
Oh yeah, at the actual world, yes, of course. I was just thinking, yes, at the actual world, it's identical. Yes.
So he's a part of as just because what I guess in the same way that the set is a member of itself kind of way. Is that the idea?
No,
Like,
no, it's just literally the same object. I mean, but long is basically his cat. Okay, long qua black is, well, his cat. There's no difference there. Why is there a difference in the like what is the point of these different expressions? It is to pick out different essences, right? But that's irrelevant to what object we're talking about.
but you're still picking out the essence.
Yeah, but to speak of its essence is to speak of its relations to counterparts, which are distinct objects.
Picked out by the essence, right?
No,
By the blackness.
The essence just is. The essence just is those counterparts, taken as a class. It isn't.
No. The essence and the thing that has the essence, the whole is what picks out the counterpart. The whole qua essence picks out the counterpart.
The whole qua essence picks out the counterpart. And
Yeah, you have to be careful not to make the essence sound like a distinct thing because he wants to avoid
Right.
that. But he does happily talk about blackness. I mean, it's a weird paragraph. He says, this is 2, right?
what do you think it is for Lois?
Just a property.
Okay, fine, but what are properties for Lois? Turns out to be very similar.
It's an excuse to go fishing in other worlds for counterparts.
Exactly. Properties and essences, which are just essential properties, are classes of counterparts.
Right.
So it is separate.
But their membership is determined, it seems, by
It's not.
it's hard to imagine that it's not when he says it's governed by things like whether or not it's important to us or by similarities. I mean, the similarities seem to point to the existence of the property, right? Whether or not, like if you look at why he doesn't think that there are some.
Yeah, this is the same argument you were making before, namely that if what worlds we're talking about is determined by the property, then it doesn't explain the property. But you're just assuming the contrary of his claim, namely that the worlds are determined rather than the determiners.
Right, because when he says things like, why can't there be just a class of long qua unaccompanied by unicorns, right? Because there's no, I mean, it's one of the one of the possible properties of long is that he's not accompanied by unicorns, and there surely is a counterpart class of longs that don't in worlds without unicorns. And he says, because the peculiar counterpart relation is so very peculiar as not to be a genuine counterpart relation at all. The similarity, if we may call it, in that between things that are unaccompanied by unicorns is in the first place one that would strike us in almost any context as utterly unimportant similarity. It is in the second place entirely extrinsic similarity. Two things both unaccompanied by unicorns could be as different as you please intrinsically, their surroundings being both nearby and remote, differ intrinsically in any respect other than the absence of unicorns. So driving all of this talk is intuitions about similarity between counterparts.
Right.
And if it's intuitions about similarities, what is it intuitions about other than intuitions about the properties that these different counterparts have?
Yeah.
Well, the answer to your question, it's about similarities, not properties. So similarities being relationships between qualities of the local particulars. Properties are not local particulars, or rather properties are not the qualities.
Properties aren't similarities of qualities.
Well, they may be, but then you've got the determination relation inverted again. Look, I mean, all of these ideas are all related in exactly the way you're saying, but what's at issue here is not whether they are related. What's at issue is what determines what. And you're taking as a given that the determiners should be identified by whatever comes most naturally to us, whatever we understand, you might say pre-theoretically, especially if the theory is so wild. But
well, I don't think, no, look, that's not me. That's Lewis saying that these things, if they don't, why is there no long qua unicorn? Precisely because that similarity doesn't come natural to us. It's uninteresting.
I don't
so much so that it's not a similarity. It's purely an extrinsic one.
I'm not sure he's saying
Like,
that
he's
there
just
are no such
playing on intuitions
objects. I think what he's saying is that they don't function as truth makers.
No, they're not counterpart relations at all, he says.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that they aren't.
Because they're so very peculiar.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that they can't be objects. Like a property is a class of counterparts, right? But you can make an object out of any collection of possibilia, even if they aren't counterparts. The point is not that it doesn't exist. The point is that it fails to be of the kind of thing that we need for a truth maker, because truth makers
so you're saying
are necessary.
Okay, because I think part of it is that you're thinking that a property is a class of counterparts with the same particular qualities,
That's
similar particular qualities.
Right.
And I think that the properties are the qualities. I don't.
Well, that's
I don't
fine, but
see
then
why.
you're addressing Lewis's theory. You're just proposing your own theory of modality.
No, I'm saying, no, I'm not saying, I'm not proposing my own theory. I'm saying that I think that that's the whole point of seeing why it's not, doesn't seem to be getting anywhere.
Well, it's because you're already there. I mean, look, the reason you think he's not getting you toward an understanding of properties is because you're imagining that you already have one, but you don't. Because a proper theory of properties.
Because I have an understanding of qualities, not properties.
No, it's because you don't have an account of modality, which a theory of properties requires. At least if you're going to get any kind of necessary relationship between propositions, truths.
But can I have an understanding of qualities without a theory of modality?
Well, look, I mean, this is not an epistemic argument. It really doesn't matter what you have an understanding of, first of all. So I'm just addressing the fact that you're finding priority in what you have prior understanding.
Wait a minute. You can't tell me that I, don't have an understanding of it without modality and then say it's not about my epistemology. Like, what is this? If I'm saying, you're saying, oh, look, you got to understand, you need particular qualities to get to properties. I'm like, oh no, just call those particular qualities the properties, just particular ones. And you're saying no, or you could do that. And I'm saying, okay, I could do that, so
Yes,
I'll
you
do
can-
that. So
well,
then I'm saying that
okay,
if you got particulars with properties, you
right.
seem to have Armstrong. You don't need Lewis.
If you have, if the qualities of the particulars are what you want to call properties, then you've just redubbed. I mean, you're just changing the meanings of the words. I mean, the whole point of properties is that it isn't of particulars. Okay, the whole point is that they are universals. So if you think properties are just the same thing as the qualities of particulars, then we're not even talking about properties.
Then you're talking about, then you're Davidson, right?
What's that?
You've got these states of affairs, which is
I'm
a
not saying
quality in a particular.
I'm not saying the states of affairs account doesn't work. It's actually very close. If there's two kinds of arguments you can make against what Lewis is proposing here. You can either say that Armstrong's is good enough, or you could say that there's no justification for talk of counterpart theory or even possible worlds, perhaps. But those criticisms should not be conflated, because Armstrong is actually talking about possible worlds and modality. He doesn't do it with counterpart theory, but he is helping himself to quite a lot of the same material. So which is it? Is it that you prefer Armstrong's theory, or is it that you just don't think we should be talking about necessity or possible worlds at all?
I don't see how the metaphysics of possible worlds is adding anything here.
Okay, so in that case, you would have to be against Armstrong's theory as well, because that's exactly what he's doing.
What's he saying?
The states of affairs metaphysics is a metaphysics of possible worlds, or of possibility,
How so?
because it gives us metaphysics for the semantics of possible worlds. He tells us what possible worlds are in terms of states of affairs.
Well, that's fine.
Right.
So, but if we're accounting for truth making with states of affairs, if we're accounting for truth makers with states of affairs, then
no, that's not what I said.
but also states of affairs could do this other work of giving us ways of understanding modality. That's fine. I'm just saying it doesn't add anything to this truth maker talk.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's helping us with truth maker theory in virtue of states of affairs being a way of giving us possible worlds or modality.
And then
it's not an independent bit of work that it does. It's part of that work.
okay, how so?
Well, I'm not sure, because I don't know enough about states of affairs by Armstrong. But
Okay,
at
so
least
but you
according
can
to
speak with great
Lewis,
confidence that that you can't do it without it, right?
well, because I know enough to know that his theory of modality is his theory of states of affairs, and Lewis himself is telling us that there isn't much of a difference between them. And we also read Armstrong on how to do modal truth makers for modal truth, and he brings in states of affairs. And also,
Right, but he doesn't. But he also
references states.
He also says things that the actual world is a fine truth maker for things like negative existential truths.
Yeah, so does Lewis in the Postscript.
And actual entities are good enough truth makers that you don't need possible world frameworks. That they don't add much to the equation.
So does Lewis in the Postscript. I mean, I think they all wanted to say, I'm the only one who's saying otherwise. But I think they all want to say that it's the truth makers at the actual world that make the proposition that world true. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing contributed by way of that truth maker, contributed by their counterparts and or their properties at other worlds, or rather, how they might have been. They're basically their
See, if I remember Armstrong, he says things like, if long the cat is black is a contingent fact, that's a fact about our world. You don't need to talk about any other counterparts for that to be a fact. It's something about the blackness of cats in our actual world, and you don't need talk of counterpart purple longs anywhere, for it to be a fact of the matter that it's a contingent fact about long. That, and as long as that's true, as long as it's a contingent fact about long that it's true, right, then this and this and this follows. But if he goes on to say that his account also gives us a way to, make sense of talk of possible worlds and stuff, that's fine. That's fine. I don't mind.
It's a matter of commitment. If the means by which he gives us a truthmaker account of a simple positive atomic truth like long is black commits us to possible worlds, and even if he's not talking about possible worlds in the analysis, we're all in. So
no, what he's saying is it doesn't commit us to.
well,
saying something like it's contingent.
No, that's not exactly what I read. It doesn't commit us to saying that the truthmaker.
You might be right that it comes in if we.
But it does commit us to speak of states of affairs, and states of affairs commit us to possible worlds.
No, I don't think he believes that's the case.
Okay.
I really don't.
Well, it doesn't matter because we're talking about the simple sentences for which one can plausibly give an account that don't bring in possible worlds. But the tricky bit here is going to be those sentences that aren't so easily managed, like negative existentials and predications.
Right. Right. And I think he had a whole section on how you can account for modal truths without possible worlds. So I just don't.
All right. I guess it would come down to.
Maybe we should.
Yeah.
But are we accounting for all living pieces here? Because remember the first Armstrong that we read, there was multiple responses saying that won't work, right? Because if you have a contingent state of affairs making true necessarily some proposition, then you're going to have issues where it makes all the necessary truths true. So some contingent fact will make true everything necessarily, or every necessary truth true. And so then he came back with a necessitation star or something like that to get around it, right? But then that's where we read other papers, like I guess Restall with entailment, real entailment, I think it was, and then Parson, who introduced the essential intrinsic property, which then you get. I'm guessing what Lewis needs, and maybe Armstrong does too, and maybe that's part of Lewis's issue, is that you need that essential relationship. You need to have that property essentially in order to make necessitation work. And that's going to bring in modality, at least.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I don't think we've read Armstrong's response to that.
No, but at least he's acknowledging that it's a problem he must deal with. That's really all I want to stand on.
Right. So I'm not sure that what we've read from Armstrong brings in modality to get that necessity.
Okay. Maybe it doesn't bring it into his solution, but it brings it in effectively by saying he has to deal with it.
Yeah.
Right. That's very loose talk. I get it, but you know what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. And I think that just gets us back to the argument over necessitation. I don't think we're at it. I think we just come back to that, like whether, we give up entailment because entailment seems to be a relationship between propositions. So but what we liked about it is that it's the idea of, look, this is a really close relationship. Like all you have to do, like in the grounding test of all God needs do, right? All God needs do to make Ralph is Brown is
right.
Truthmaker.
And
so then, so then if you can,
we know why it has to be necessary, namely because we want it to be explanatory. It can't be explanatory.
Well, no, there could be ways of, I think explanations can happen without necessitation, but maybe that's controversial.
I think that's where we have to leave it. The only way to come back to truthmaker theory without necessitation would first have to give us explanation without it.
Yeah, because I think, and why I think I think that necessitation plays the role in explanation of capturing intuitions about well, you often, I think sufficiency, like there's nothing missing. And yeah. So that gives us a complete explanation of why something happened, right? Because we have this idea that, oh yeah, we're not missing some key ingredient to understand why that happened. There's no important piece missing, and that's the sense in which we want to say like something like necessitation is part of explanation, but the necessitation of that gets us involved in all this logical apparatus, I'm not sure.
Right.
I'm not sure. It's like a completeness condition rather than
All right.
logical one.
I think I'm done with Truthmakers for now. What do you think? How about you?
I'm long done.
Actually, I think you're the least done of all, Josh, because you want to go through Armstrong's book.
I'm Josh Qua, done with Truthmaker.
Well, maybe one of the other Joshes come next time. We'll have one more
Maybe.
round.
I hope this isn't an essential property.
Send a counterpart. Josh Qua, give it one more try.
Yeah.